let's deal with another curse that was propagated by a Catholic cardinal, or no, actually there was a bishop. So um, the bishop's name isn't quoted because it's not recalled. It doesn't appear to be a majority opinion, but because a person like that could exercise ideological influence, it might actually contribute to a situation. So the bishop in question, don't think they were Australian. They had a blog. So there was a post on their blog, and on their post they tried to argue that feminism was demonic. And so let's try and untangle that idea for a moment. Okay, so um, there's what feminism isn't, which is described quite well in the video what men think feminism is. Okay, that's not what feminism is. There's and so what feminism is a series of social movements created by women in relation to how their respective cultures had denied them equal and just treatment under the legal system or the social or political systems, and how prejudice towards women had been experienced by women and what they wanted to do about it. And so the various and sundry expressions of their frustration and confusion that relates to that. When it comes to feminist theory as a sociological idea, that's a little bit more. It's a little bit more specific. So what was just said can imply lots of different things. In a similar way that the men complaining about how they've been hard done by could be expressed in lots of different ways as well. Feminist theory is not something this body has divulged into a lot. However, there is obviously, like when anyone studies social science thing or sociology, they might get a small taste of it. And so what it basically is comments made earlier in other videos about patricianarchy. So they say patriarchy, but probably the better word for it is patricianarchy, because what they're saying is that, and particularly that started to say during third wave feminism in the Anglophone societies, was that there was a relationship between class and gender when it came to inequality. And specifically, classism has related to gender roles. So the patricians is the word that it comes from. So instead of saying patriarchy, the word patricianarchy is being used to clarify what seems to have been said, which is they're basically saying that the gender roles has meant that that men are being hard done by some kind of patricianarchy or patriarchal social structure in such a manner that it's subjugating women. So the patriarchy is bad for both. In some respects, the liberation of women does involve the liberation of men, and specifically from presuppositions about said gender roles. So to explain the word patri versus patrician, patri implies rule by father, but that's not the case. It's actually referring to rule by patrician, also known as an aristocracy. Okay, so in ancient Rome, they had the patricians versus the plebeians, these days known as labour versus capital. The aristocracy in Europe gradually, over the course of the Renaissance period and the Industrial Revolution, started to gradually become usurped by a corporate class of merchants that did not have peerage or what you might call family ancestry associated with the patricians or the aristocracy or any other aristocratic group that weren't from the original patrician class of ancient Rome, but were from a aristocratic ruling class of their respective society. So the patrician class or capital, or the aristocracy as it's sometimes known. So there's sort of like a complex relationship between those three ideas. Has had over the course of time and some millennia earlier, in a in a land far, far away, had come up with these ideas about what constitutes male behaviour and what constitutes female behaviour, and the relationship between the two, how that's socially enforced, how that's enforced through the legal system, etc., etc., etc. And so some of those ideas were expressed in the Bible. The Bible is what is can be considered a work of the Roman patricianarchy, attempting to rebrand itself as a theocracy during the time of Constantine. That's probably historically more accurate than saying it's true, or the Jews wrote it, because they probably didn't. And so the Roman patricianarchy was having a bit of trouble, and by the looks of it, around that time, and they started to do what the Romans were known to do, which is to get different ideas from different provinces and sort of rebrand them Roman style. And so that's how Neptune became a Roman god. That was originally Poseidon from the ancient Greeks, who in turn got it from the Moroccans and possibly the original people of Atlantis, okay, which is an island not too far from the Canary Islands that sunk during a tsunami, most likely during the Santorini eruption. And so, what the Romans used to do is get ideas from the different provinces that they invaded, and then Romanize them. And so they've done that in such a manner to engage in ideological supremacy over the provinces by the creation of Christianity. So what they're talking about in the New Testament, and what the Christians, or that might have been, or what the people they call the Christians these days might have been doing in the 400 years before that, are probably not the same. And so in that respect, that's why you get this debate as well between post-Vatican Christianity and the Essenes. Now, what the Essenes were talking about, and what they say the Nag Hammadi text talks about, are not the same either. And what they were talking about, and what the schisms within Judaism that were partially associated with the rebellion against the Romans, might not be the same thing either. You're talking about a time, a 400-year, 500-year period time of enormous upheaval, from the time of Julius Caesar in 60 BC to the time of Constantine in 400 AD, in a time of enormous turmoil throughout Europe, Britannia, Mesopotamia, Middle East, and North Africa. That whole area was like the Romans really upset the apple cart, and were rearranging those apples to suit them quite regularly. And the crucifixion symbolism is, of course, Roman. So that patricianarchy that did that turned the Roman Empire into a theocracy, with the invention of Constantinian Christianity and the Nicene Creed, were also usurping the possibility of, by creating a empire-wide cult, we're trying to uniform the ideology of the people in their empire. And so any cultures that had different opinions, which, by the way, of course they did, because they were different cultures, were then subjected to that. So some people make a false assumption that prior to Constantinian Christianity and the Holy Roman theocracy called Christendom, that the Visigoths or the Huns, for example, were matriarchal. It isn't necessarily the case at all. The presence of matriarchy in those societies varies quite considerably from region to region and time to time. There's evidence to support they had male chieftain systems with councils as well. That evidence comes from the Celts. The Druidic culture that formed in the late era of the BC era, and also during the early eras of the AD, basically. The Druids are an example of a different culture and society to the Visigoths and the Huns and whatever. They're all different, and the Romans have attempted to create uniformity for Christianity. And so the patricianarchy in that case is the overlaying of the political structures throughout this created region called Christendom, previously known as the Roman Empire, with the patricians acting as the aristocrats. And so when they've done that, some of the ideas in the New Testament come from the ancient Greeks. They don't necessarily come from the Jews, although some do come from the Jews. So it's a sort of a mishmash. And one of the things historians have noticed is that the ancient Greeks were the ones that said that women don't have souls. The ancient Greeks were the ones that said that Hades was a place of punishment, and had a story of Pluto and Persephone, for example. It wasn't actually the Jews that said that. The Jews actually said that Sheol was a place of transitions, so spirits move from one place to the other. It's the ideas of underworld vary from culture to culture as well, and then they've adopted that. And so it's actually the case, if you read the New Testament, it doesn't say that Hades is a place of punishment either. It's not said there at all. That came from Vatican doctrine post Constantine. So it becomes a bit more complicated when you do that. So the way that particular aristocratic patrician superstructure, okay, has infiltrated the ideology of a wide range of people through propaganda and doctrine, has contributed to a sort of cultural fear, okay, that is sort of expressed in sort of like other schisms that came out of that. So Masonry, Theosophy, bloody blah blah blah, goes on like that. Wicca, blah 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 blah. And so the sort of cultural fear that through language that might have happened might lead to misinterpretations by Catholic bishops that feminism is demonic. So why would feminism be demonic? Well, feminism specifically has challenged specific phrases in the Bible. One such as a woman is not allowed to be a witness in court and requires two male witnesses to speak for her. Because prior to the Industrial Revolution, the ecclesiastical courts were entwined with the what's now secular courts. It meant that biblical readings were included in court rulings. And so it also meant that women were not allowed to appear as witnesses in cases that concerned them. Whether they were the plaintiff or the defendant was beside the point, or just a witness. They just weren't allowed to. And so in the English common law courts, that was the case until 1873. And when they made a ruling that said a woman could do that. Feminism, with things like women have the right to vote, women have the right to drive cars, women have the right to exist, is one of them. An example of feminism is women have the right to exist. Apparently that's, if you're dealing with ancient Greeks, that's considered, radical. And so this sort of radical notion that women have the right to exist is concerning. Because again, the Vatican does acknowledge that Aristotle was one of the contributors philosophically, and although much later on, the Vatican did not argue that woman has no soul, and argue that they do. It is actually the case. Aristotle was one of the people that argued that women don't. So the sort of founding premises of Vaticanism and Christianity throughout Europe, and the patricianarchy culture that comes from the Vatican is just that. It starts on the basis of misogyny, actually. And the misogyny didn't necessarily originate with the Romans. It didn't necessarily originate with the Jews, but it's complex where it came from. Nonetheless, there it was, and so we're challenging those types of basic ideas. Taking hundreds of years or so, and influences from other groups like Muslims, Jews, Arabs, other cultural influences or whatever, to overcome that, and also people, the coalface arguments that doesn't make any sense. Protestants also, it's sort of it's been a couple of thousand years of challenges, and so when it comes to that, to say that feminism is demonic when feminism is sort of a direct challenging of the gender, in one instance, the direct challenging of the gender role that women can't witness or testify, is as just one example of it is, how can you say that's demonic? I mean, how can you say it's demonic to challenge the idea that if a woman gets assaulted or raped, that her father should be paid compensation in the form of a dowry, and she should be married to the offender, or alternatively, if she's already married, then the husband gets paid compensation because he's spoiled goods. That's a direct quote from the Bible, from the New Testament. I mean, how can you argue that the basic dignity of saying that people have the right to speak for themselves, and also on matters where they were assaulted, someone else shouldn't be compensated and they shouldn't be treated like fucking property for the offender or anyone else? How can you say that challenging that is demonic? It sounds more, if demonic relates to the devil, okay, which the Catholics and Christians would typically argue, okay, and the devil is a liar and deceiver and blah, 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 and only wants bad things and nasty things for the community and whatever else, then the basic lack of dignity in those ideas suggests that patriarchy is demonic. And that feminism is actually an antidote to that demonic attitude of the patriarchy. Okay, doesn't that sound like patriarchy is demonic? Well, it does. Is it a liar and a deceiver and a fraud to turn around and say that men are just sex fiends who want to dominate, possess, and control? Well, they don't all think like that. Okay, they have really mixed up freaking social roles and attitudes that go with it to try and with the corresponding behaviours to try and overcome anyone who does. It's kind of like ineffective. But it doesn't mean they all genuinely think like that. Some are really radically opposed to it, actually. And it might be time to just acknowledge that patriarchy is demonic. And it's engaged in a form of Darvo by saying that any idea that challenges it is the bad guy. Okay, so get stuffed. Men being seen as sex fiends that want to bash you up. Okay, it's not feminism. Okay, it's not men's rights. Okay, that's patriarchy. That's patriarchy giving men a two aspected social role. Okay, that denies them their complexity. Okay, say women are, the old story about the Madonna whore complex. Okay, that's, the duality of women's roles in that. Okay, that's patriarchy. That's not feminism. If a woman wants to be a wholly ascetic woman, okay, it doesn't mean that she's a repressed Catholic. It might mean she's a Buddhist nun. Or just operating on some completely different set of principles. She could just be an asexual person, actually. What about if a man does that? It doesn't mean he's a repressed Catholic priest. He could be a Buddhist monk too, or maybe he's just an ascetic of a different kind. These things are possible. Let's look at the demonization of the asexual man as an example of patriarchy. Okay, we're going to have to do this. It's actually quite important. The demonization of the asexual man. So the asexual man is a direct challenge to patriarchal authority by assuming that men have a particular role that they do not necessarily have. The presentation of asexual men in the media has been, suffice to say, limited at best, if not non-existent, and at worst, presenting them as Buffalo Bill. Okay? The only asexual character of a man that is known in the English-speaking language is Buffalo Bill from Silence of the Lambs, a serial killer who keeps women in a fucking hole, okay, and then skins them and wears their skin, and says it puts the lotion on its skin, otherwise it gets the hose again. Okay? That is not an asexual man. That's damaged goods. That's a bad character, okay? Okay? An asexual man is just a man who's not interested. Okay? Okay. What's the difference between an asexual man and an ascetic man? ASCETIC. Okay, so like a monk or a priest or something like that, is those people have taken a vow called celibacy. So they've decided that certain types of behaviour are fettered and are denying them the opportunity to attain some kind of spiritual advancement or be leaders of a spiritual community or religious community or whatever it might be. Okay, so they're people who, they're men who look at boobies, okay, or if they're gay, they look at men's bums, okay, but they try and turn away and not do that because that's not the vow that they took, right? Okay, that is drastically different from an asexual man who doesn't want to look at all. Okay, he's not interested. He might be interested in spaceships, or he might be interested in mathematics, or he might be interested in in like sort of really abstract, bizarre, even schizoid ideas, depending on how far he goes, right? So for a man like that to have basically two options, okay, some kind of some kind of repressed ascetic male character as acting as a functionary for religion that was commandeered by or created by some kind of hierarchical institutional paradigm to create some kind of aristocratic patriarchal superstructure, or a serial killer, okay, is really not a healthy set of what you might call role modeling. They've got nothing to look to for that. So, to all the asexual men out there who are openly asexual and try to describe what that means to the sort of rest of society, thank you for doing that, because the asexual men of the world do need those role models. They do need to see that there are other men like them. Men who are just not interested. They don't have low libido. It's not because of trauma or whatever. They're just not interested. Is vitally important. And so the men doing toxic shaming of men like that, or women who join in, ought not to do that. So this sort of some of the hierarchy of chakras or whatever, and how that's been used by different cults and religions, does have a component to it which is somewhat dangerous for asexual men and women. It's dangerous for them because they've made a series of assumptions, and then in some cases, when you're talking about the esoteric idea of the blue crystal grid, coded it falsely based on the illusory correlations that came from post-Blavatsky cults and post-Thelema cults, to basically misalign the ideas in such a manner that presumptions have been made that are simply not there. So please, we've got to de-demonize the asexual people. Asexual people are not perverts. Asexual people are not serial killers. Asexual people are not repressed ascetics. Asexual people are just not interested. Okay, they've got a different way of doing things. So the men who are a bit on the hypersexual side, or men who are misogynistic and see women as holes or whatever else, or men as dicks or whatever, because they've failed in their complex reasoning, okay, and made assumptions about other men that are not true and women that are not true. Okay, if anyone does not want contact with you because they're not interested, it's because they're not interested. They're not interested independently of all our errors. They're just not interested. You need to just accept that, to not analyze, to move on and get over it. Okay? Because what some of these satanic groups and these religious groups do in response to saying that to them is just horrendous. The consequences are horrendous. It's just ridiculous. And those guys need to be told off. What they're doing, they need to be told off, okay? Okay? It's just plain fucking wrong. Okay? And so what you need to comprehend is that the cults are wrong. The cults cause the problems, and they're wrong. Okay? They're factually wrong. They're ethically wrong. Okay? They've completely misaligned a whole bunch of stuff because they're wrong. Okay? Once it's done to asexual men, it's also wrong. Okay? It's an example of misogyny and misandry both. Okay? If you can't tell the difference between an ascetic and an asexual because you're a hypersexual man who has some kind of cult problem, okay, you presume everyone's supposed to be like you because you think you're Mr. Perfect, then you've disrespected other people. Okay? You can't assume that people want to be like you, no matter who you are. Even if they wound up in your head, they would still not want to be like you. They want to be like whoever they are. And that's their fucking right. It's also their right to go home and be safe as well, should that type of idea eventuate. Okay, so that was a general possibility or fact or even happening right now. They would still have that right. And should not be demonised for doing so. Okay? This demonising of victims of crime, this demonising of women, this demonising of men, because those people, heaven forbid, stops the patricianarchy, which tries to claim let's look at an example, okay? Patricianarchy, how it applied to the case of Shay Francis, okay? This is a horrible story, okay? There's a story about a woman named Shay Francis who was a nice person. She really was, okay? And she was from Shepparton in Victoria. And what's happened is her mother's gotten sick lived in Queensland and gotten sick. So her and her boyfriend Jason Cooper have gone to Queensland in 2018 sometime and stayed at a hostel so that they could go visit her mum in the hospital. And while that was going on, Shay's passed away. And Jason Cooper has lied to her family and spent her money on credit cards and pretended she was alive to prevent her being searched for. And then later, when he's gotten busted, he's claimed that he was planning on burying her at the beach, but got scared by a copper and chucked her in a garbage bin. Okay, so let's pull that story apart, okay? Because this physical body met Shay Francis and Jason Cooper in that hostel before she died. Okay, and she was a nice person. She really was. Those two people drank. That particular area of the hostel was known for blow-ins with problems. They're having problems with the housing market, so they were in long-stay accommodation in that part of the hostel. It was a large hostel. Management did not have enough staff to look after the place. There was a man there who was a beat cop who had just gotten divorced, who was living in the hostel. So there was a man there who had just experienced a divorce, and while he was finding new housing, he was staying in the hostel. He happened to be a local copper who worked in the area on the beats. He actually knew both of them, and was probably keeping an eye. So let's put this into perspective, okay? The event, whatever events unfolded that led to her death, this physical body was not at that hostel during that time. They've left before that, and then found out a year or two later that something had happened and became absolutely fucking devastated that happened. Like, what happened is stayed at the hostel and became her friend because she had been protected. Things like that. That type of guilt tripping happened, right? And it's like, well, hang on, what actually happened there? Okay, why didn't the copper that was living there notice in that 3 weeks? Because the others commented that they could smell dead meat, like rotting meat from that room. How come they didn't notice it? Shay Francis was a cigarette smoker. So was Jason Cooper. She used to go out onto the balcony outside their room and, in the area where the car park was, and have cigarettes because, it's a no-smoking room. Okay, so she used to smoke outside, smoke her rollies outside. And how could they not notice that a habitual cigarette smoker wasn't coming outside for a cigarette? Like, as a habitual cigarette smoker might struggle to not light a cigarette while making a YouTube video. Like, that person in 3, like, come on. There's something very wrong with that story. So, in addition to the obvious anger towards Mr. Cooper, which is never going to end, quite frankly, because that's disgusting. And seriously, the Francis family out there, if this is offending you, just say so, because don't want to offend you at all. Hope he finds her. Hope she gets found and gets a proper burial. You deserve that closure, and so does she. That, like seriously, that's a horrible thing. That's terrible. And the anger is genuine, and the anger would have been genuine from hub management as well, because the hostel was called the Hub. Hub management would have been upset, and so would that copper, to be fair. However, there's something wrong with the idea that he was living there and keeping an eye on them, but he didn't notice that she hadn't come out for a cigarette in 3 weeks as well. Like, what was going on there? And as for being scared by the copper, well, why didn't the copper notice? And how come when the garbage man took because they had these big skip bins, how come when the garbage man came and collected the skip bins, they didn't notice, oh God, like her wrapped up in something, you know, like, was it a sleeping bag or something they said? Like, how could they not notice that? How could they not notice that when she was put in that bin and they were putting other objects in that bin when they were cleaning up? How could they not notice? Okay, because the answer is that's not what happened. He lied about that too. Okay, he's lied about that. They've gone and they've searched the tip. Okay, this got looked up, because when they got found, it got looked up. The different articles of it, I went, holy crap, right? And okay, they didn't find her at the tip. Okay, they didn't find her at the tip, because that's not where she bloody is. Okay, do the fucking maths. Okay, he's buried her somewhere else and then lied about it. Okay, not trying to scare you out there, but he's probably killed her. Okay, it didn't seem like at the time that's where they were going, but they didn't seem particularly happy either. And so. How does the patriarchy relate to that? Well, the patriarchy relates to that because whatever toxic codes it gave that men to act like that would have influenced the situation. The patriarchy relates to that because of that alone. The patriarchy relates to that because it teaches people to look away. Like, teaches people to take a man's word. I mean, was she? They say she was in there dead for 3 weeks, and Cooper was in there looking at her dead body, presumably driven insane by the sight of it. You know, because even if he didn't do anything wrong, or there was an accident or something like that, just seeing her dead would have driven that man insane. Would have driven anyone insane. Seeing dead bodies breaks a person's head. Okay? You can guarantee that, regardless of what they were like before that, it breaks their head. Breaks their head. It's something that people can't comprehend. Even people who work in emergency services struggle with that. They have professional training, debriefing and stuff like that. But part of them breaks just a little bit when that happens, even with all that training. Military likewise. Okay. So for a civilian who doesn't have like medical training or military training, that just breaks their head. So that man's head was broken after she died. Before she died, more than likely very broken already, and we don't know how she died. That's the problem with situations like that. We don't know what happened to her. they're still relying on that man's word. When they gave that man 18 months for interfering with a corpse and credit card fraud, they were taking him at his word. His word that he got scared and disposed of corpse improperly. They don't have the corpse to verify whether or not her death was accidental or as a result of an illness or something like that, or worse, foul play. They have no evidence to support in any direction what her cause of death was. There's no closure. They've relied on that man's testimony, and given the circumstances that he literally committed fraud with her credit cards, knowing she was deceased, his word's not trustworthy. You can absolutely guarantee that even a schizophrenic man, okay, who is off his face, something would click in his head when he sees a corpse, particularly the corpse of a loved one, that he would have the social program that says, dial 000, dial it now, you didn't do anything wrong, they need help, do it. They wouldn't sit there drunk for 3 weeks. They'd go into shock, yes. They'd go into despair, grief, confusion, yes. Their head would break, there's no question about it. But there's a point at the beginning where you don't know if they're dead or not. They could just be sleeping. They could just be hungover. And you go, dial 000. Now, why didn't he do that? Why didn't Jason Cooper do that? Why didn't Jason Cooper, in that time, that early time, or that 3-week period, anyway, don't worry about that. So, why didn't he call 000? Was it because he was scared? Because he was crazy? Or because he was guilty? If you've ever had to deal with a crazy man, after the initial shock sets in, he'd call 000. Even if he's hallucinating, he'd still know to do that. Can't think of a single reason why he didn't do that, unless he was guilty of a crime. Been through this over and over again, like a shock replay, going through the logic, trying to figure out what was going through that man's head. And the only thing that can be thought of is that he was guilty of a crime. Even in situations of DV where it's accidental, so maybe the punch was a little bit too hard or something like that, they call 000. Even then. Why was that man's word taken at all? They found him guilty of fraud, credit card fraud. The moment that conviction happened and they realised he was guilty of that, his other word should have been taken with a grain of salt. Because fraud is a type of dishonesty. Why was more value placed on the word of the offender than the evidence of the absence of her body and the circumstances, mysterious they are now, still, about her death. Is that because there is such a thing as patriarchy? There is such a thing as a man's word or testimony is still, on some level, subliminally valued slightly more than a woman's. Shay Francis can't speak to you today, but she was a nice person. She really was. And she would have been honest too. She would have told the truth. We can't value the testimony of Prince Andrew and Donald Trump more than Virginia Giuffre. We can't. We just can't do it. Their social status, regardless of their gender, doesn't imply greater value in their testimony. Donald Trump was convicted of 34 counts of fraud. He's not trustworthy. We can't continue to blame men who didn't do anything wrong or even tried to help either. We can ask questions about kind of the pulling of ranks type behaviour the men do when they're scared, and women also sometimes do when they're scared. We can ask questions about that. Okay? We can't have a situation anymore in the world where anyone winds up dead because someone offended against them, and the offender convicted of fraud is considered by anyone to have greater weight to speak than the victim. And that's true of any gender, any race, any ethnicity, any person. If a man was offended against by a woman, you can't assume that the woman's not at fault. If a woman was offended against by a woman, then you can't assume that the woman's not at fault either. It works both ways, you know. Assuming that women are only weak and vulnerable isn't true. Because don't forget, just because Aristotle said that, it doesn't mean it's fucking true. It never was true. Aristotle lied. Okay? Men deserve better than to be put in the basket of evil ones. And women deserve better than to be put in the basket of sweet, demure, innocent ones. Neither of them are that. Both are confused. Both try each in their own way. And challenging the patriarchy isn't about the video, what men think feminism is. It's about acknowledging that everyone is unique. And also, that people like Shay Francis and Virginia Giuffre deserve better. But not just them. Not just them. Every man who is a survivor of what the Royal Commission talked about in Australia deserves better too. Every man he was conscripted to go to a war deserves better too. And every man who's an asexual, he got told they were Buffalo Bill, definitely deserves better too than that. Even if they become a bad person later because they were confused, they still deserve better back then. True story.